Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Maxon. Breaking news, Israel's cabinet has agreed to a hostage deal with Hamas, which will see 50 Israelis freed within days. The full details in a moment. And in more breaking news, the Albanese government has granted temporary visas to 860 Palestinians in Gaza since October 7. Questions over what security checks have been done. Criminal detainees, including child sex abusers, are said to be walking around without trackers. Bridget McKenzie and Andrew Charlton will join me later to discuss. And the Prime Minister and opposition leader stood united today against anti-Semitism outside Melbourne's Holocaust Museum. Is it enough to counteract Albanese's lacklustre response to the pro-Palestinian protests? But first, to tonight's breaking news. Israel has agreed to a deal that will see 50 Israeli hostages freed in return for a 5-day ceasefire and the release of 150 Palestinian prisoners. The deal was reached during a late-night, 7-hour emergency sitting of the Israeli cabinet. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed the deal, saying his government was obligated to return home all of the hostages. He said in a statement tonight, the government has approved the outline of the first stage of achieving this goal, according to which at least 50 hostages, women and children, will be released over 4 days, during which a pause in the fighting will be held. The release of every additional 10 hostages will result in 1 additional day in the pause. The government of Israel, the IDF and the security services will continue the war in order to return home all of the hostages, complete the elimination of Hamas and ensure that there will be no new threat to the state of Israel from Gaza. The 236 hostages have already been held in captivity for 47 days. Among the first 50 Israeli hostages to be freed are 30 children, 8 mothers and 12 other women. 3 Americans will be among those released, including a 3-year-old girl, Abigail. Now, a reminder, this is just 50 of the 236 Israelis held hostage. There's incredible hope for the hundreds of families who have family members in Gaza. For some, there'll be unimaginable happiness as they're finally reunited. But for others, witnessing these reunions and desperately missing their own loved ones will be crushing. Experts today said the hostages will be in a state of distress.
What we can expect is that they are going to be exhausted. They are going to be, their health is going to be not ideal, and they are going to be traumatized. They have yet to be able to even have an opportunity to process the violent, tragic, terrorist attack in which they were abducted. So this has really been compounded.
Now, it wasn't part of the Israeli government's official statement, but it's been reported that as part of the deal, Hamas would have to provide the Red Cross with access to the remaining hostages. And it's still unclear when this deal, when the pause in fighting, will start. Qatar, which is providing safe harbour to some Hamas political leadership, is reported to have been critical in these negotiations, along with the United States. Now, some are asking why 50 innocent Israelis in return for 150 Palestinian criminals, including terrorists. Well, this is the deal that's been struck, and it shows how eager Israel is to see the return of its beautiful, innocent children. But think about this. 50 innocent Israelis for 150 Palestinian women and youth prisoners. They're criminals. They're not innocent. Among those who'll reportedly be released is a woman who was involved in a terror attack who blew up a gas container that injured a police officer. Now, I've spoken to sources today, and my understanding of how this will work is that each night Hamas will give mediators who will then hand to Israel a list with the names of around 12 hostages who will be freed the next day. Israel doesn't know ahead of time who they'll be. For families of those who are missing, believed to be held hostage, this is going to be an extremely anxious time, hoping that their child, parent, brother or sister will be among those chosen for release. Now, here's some other inside information. Hamas themselves do not have overall clarity of the whereabouts of each of the 236 hostages. Hamas is holding some of the hostages, but I understand others are held by the terror group, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist organisations. It's understood Hamas only knows about 30 children and 8 mothers, and this is contrary to the information that Israel has about how many women and children are being held hostage in Gaza. There are hopes that the 10-month-old baby, who, as you know, was captured when he was just 9 months old, will be brought home. But the truth is, Israel doesn't even know whether the baby is among those that are being held by Hamas. Now, many of you will rightly so be worried about how Hamas will use this ceasefire, because effectively it is a ceasefire, to regroup and prepare militarily. And let's be clear, Hamas has been pleading for this deal. Well, the IDF spokesman, Jonathan Conricus, admits that he's too concerned that Hamas is going to take advantage of the lull in fighting to potentially attack Israel once again. But he made the point that for the families who are separated from their loved ones, every minute apart matters.
Are you worried that the pause in fighting for the hostage release could be a setback for the IDF and give Hamas time to regroup?
Yeah, you know, one would hope that Hamas has been asking or pleading for this pause for many days now. One would hope that they would use it in order to care for civilians in the southern Gaza Strip and take care of their needs. But I think one would be naive in doing so. Hamas, they don't care about the Palestinians. They don't care about their humanitarian needs. And I fear that Hamas will use the pause in fighting in order to try to resupply and regroup. Of course, we would rather continue to apply pressure on Hamas, continue to fight them and defeat them in their strongholds, as we are doing in northern Gaza City. But this pause is, of course, for a very, very important cause.
You can see the clear dilemma there that Israel has been facing. But it's also worth pointing out that the families of the hostages have been begging and even protesting for the Israeli government to take action. This has become a live political issue for Netanyahu. He's been under pressure over the hostages and what he's doing to free them. The positive news is that all security forces, from the IDF to Mossad and the ISA, are in favour of this deal going ahead. And they say that it ultimately won't have a negative impact on the next phase of the war. Netanyahu was also clear that the war will continue and he's not going to start negotiating a ceasefire after this. But the reality is, as you heard from Jonathan Conricus, the spokesperson for the IDF, this will give Hamas, which has been in retreat, time to reassemble and regroup, potentially even to get more supplies, given fuel and international aid will be allowed into Gaza as part of this deal. Fuel that will most likely be used for rockets, even though it's intended for civilians. The simple fact that Hamas is desperate to negotiate and is willing to release hostages is a clear indication that up until this point, Israel is winning. Hamas hears the sound of Israeli armoured vehicles getting closer and closer. Their tunnels are being destroyed and their military leaders are being killed. And they're running out of supplies and fuel for rockets. It's likely they're going to do everything they can to prolong this 4-day pause. They're not going to be in a hurry to release hostages. It's their only bargaining chip. And one source told me today that it's even likely Hamas will find a reason to argue that Israel has violated the terms of the agreement in order to prolong the ceasefire. But Israel is adamant it won't let the terrorists exploit the deal. As Jonathan Conricus said today, at the end of this war, Israel will free Gaza from Hamas. And I'd add, Israel will free the West from Hamas too, whether the left likes it or not.
At the end of this war, I think that we will free Gaza Strip from Hamas. And at the end of it, the people of Hamas will be people of Gaza, will be in a much better place than they have been for the last 17 years under the oppressive rule of Hamas.
Now to more breaking news this afternoon. The Albanese government has granted hundreds of temporary visas to Palestinians since the October 7 terror attacks. Anthony Albanese has provided 860 visas for Palestinians who aren't Australian citizens to come to Australia between October 7 and November 20th. 860. The ABC reports, and I quote, the Australian government has granted hundreds of temporary visas to Palestinians in the weeks since Israel began its bombing campaign of Gaza, which has killed thousands of civilians and flattened large swaths of the densely populated Strip. Now, Foreign Minister Penny Wong held a press conference this afternoon and she claimed that security checks were being done on these 860 people.
Well, again, I'd go back to this. People who obtain Australian visas are subject to appropriate security checks. And these people have been subjected to the same security checks by Australian Border Force and authorities, as you would expect any visa applicant would be required.
She then called for the next steps towards a sustainable ceasefire. She said she remains deeply concerned about the loss of civilian life. Well, given the Albanese government has just allowed rapists and murderers onto our streets without any real precautions until they were forced by Peter Dutton into legislation to put ankle bracelets on them, you can be forgiven for questioning their security process and having no confidence that they're actually doing proper security checks. This government is clearly weak on national security. Now, those granted visas might be innocent Palestinians. They might be. But what security checks are being done to make sure they don't have links to Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or other terror groups? The visas have already been granted between October 7 and November 20, just a couple of days ago. So the security process can't have been that vigorous if they were rushed through. The Albanese government seems to have lost its mind on national security. We need to ask what checks are being done to make sure that these Palestinians share our Australian values and aren't going to be importing any hatred of Jews from the front line of the war onto our safe Australian streets. Well, here was the Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan making this point today.
The government needs to come out, be transparent and let us know what processes have been undertaken, on what basis have the visas been granted and whether the proper security checks have been undertaken. That would be the type of information that the Australian people would rightly expect from a government. But once again, all we're learning is via the media, and we need transparency, and especially transparency around whether all the proper processes were undertaken, especially the proper security checks.
So let's be clear, these 860 are not Australian citizens. The government already brought home Australian citizens and permanent residents. The Department of Home Affairs says that the 860 visas have been approved for Palestinians with connections to Australia. So what does that mean? Does it mean they visited here? They know someone who's here? The government hasn't been clear about this. And these are Palestinians from the front line of the war. How do we know that some of them may not be Hamas? I'm sorry, but when we're already experiencing strong anti-Semitism on our streets, we have to take steps to ensure that we aren't importing more hatred into Australia. We don't want our Jewish children further at risk from anyone who's been at the very front line of this brutal conflict. The idea that all Palestinians are innocent civilians is naive. Of course, many of them are unwitting victims of Hamas, and they need to be rescued from Hamas, as Jonathan Conricker said. But others agree with the hatred. Others have been pictured celebrating terror attacks against Israel. Others gathered round a Jewish woman as she was dragged through the streets of Hamas on October 7th. There is no doubt that some children in Gaza and the West Bank are brought up to hate Jews. They're indoctrinated. This isn't the way Israelis and Jews are raised, to hate. This is an insult by the Albanese government not to be taking proper security precautions. Anthony Albanese visited the Holocaust Museum today in Melbourne, speaking about anti-Semitism, but then he's allowing nearly 1,000 people into Australia from the front line of Gaza. Has he considered what this might do to anti-Semitism in this country if rigorous security checks aren't done? Does he think this is going to make our lives safer and more secure? The Australian Israel and Jewish Affairs Council Executive Director Dr. Colin Rubenstein told me in a statement that Australia has a long tradition of providing temporary visas and other similar visas, and that should continue, especially for civilians at risk. But the community needs to be assured that thorough and proper security and safety checks will be undertaken regardless of their origin. That is a basic principle of a robust and viable immigration system. He says the community will want to know who is selecting the candidates for the visas and who is doing the security screening. He says given that Gaza is a territory whose governing authority is a murderous, listed terrorist organisation in Australia, detailed scrutiny would seem to be required to ensure Hamas activists and supporters, or even worse, Hamas terrorists, are not inadvertently admitted into Australia. Now, again, these visas, 860 given from October 7, the date of the terror attacks, to November 20. The question needs to be asked whether Hamas is trawling through their social media, their phone messages, their internet use to make sure some of them don't have terror allegiances. Albanese could be providing safe passage to Australia for Hamas terrorists who Israeli media reports are melting away from Gaza. It's extremely worrying. We have every right to be concerned, and you'd be forgiven for having no faith that our government will, especially under the hapless Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles, be making sure that terrorist sympathisers and anti-Semites aren't being flown right into our peaceful cities at a time when already anti-Semitism is a major problem, an epidemic. Albanese needs to do more, in my opinion, to show he cares about this issue of anti-Semitism, not just words, but action. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so quickly, without time for security screening, be welcoming with open arms nearly 1,000 people who are not Australian citizens. Sky News host Steve Price joins me now. Steve, given the debacle we've seen since the High Court with these criminals free in our streets, what confidence do you have that the government would have so quickly, until just a couple of days ago, conducted thorough security checks for the 860 Palestinians given temporary visas since October 7?
I've got no confidence at all. I mean, federal Labor has a habit of bungling national security. We saw what happened under Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard and the boat people smugglers. There is no way that since October 7 you could do proper checks on these people. And Australia always seems very quick to rush to provide this security for people without checking properly. And I think you make an excellent point that there would be a lot of people within Palestine who had connections to Hamas who would be trying to hide that, and a perfect escape route would be via an Australian government-sponsored flight with a temporary visa into our country. And I think most people in Australia would be very nervous about that. And it comes at a time, as you say, where we've just released into the public a bunch of people who should still be in detention, child molesters, murderers, people who have been alleged of being terrorists themselves. Why do we keep doing this, Sharri?
I mean, if it wasn't for that, you might think, oh, well, they've got the security system under control, but they clearly don't. The Immigration Minister, the Home Affairs Minister have been exposed as weak on national security. Steve, just last night, more than 20 pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested in Botany Bay in Sydney. This was after they targeted the Israeli shipping line Zim as it unloaded. The New South Wales government did take very strong action. About 20 people, as I said, arrested. The New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, spoke out strongly about it today. Have a look.
Protests are lawful in New South Wales, but you must do it within the law. And if people breach those standards, if they breach those laws, they'll be arrested. This is a very difficult thing to manage. It's a combustible situation. These events are on the other side of the world, and it's not possible for us to influence events that are taking place on the other side of the world.
And as we know, his electorate office was targeted by protesters yesterday. And Steve, tomorrow, school children plan to walk out of the classrooms and join a Students for Palestine protest. And we hear that there's demonstrations also planned, not just for Melbourne, but for Sydney, Adelaide and Wollongong.
Yeah, these student protests now seem to be national. I mean, when you just think about it, how ludicrous this all is. We saw that protest last night. You can go back to the Sydney Opera House protest originally, where you had people screaming out, "Gas the Jews, F the Jews," and we're intending to bring more Palestinian people into the country. You had a young Palestinian protester at the Sydney protest last night claiming that there was police brutality and that they'd handled the thing too roughly. And yet we announced today we're going to bring more people in to see these protests happen. As for the schools, I mean, this is just crazy stuff. And look, I've got a lot of regard for Chris Minns, the Premier of New South Wales, less regard for the Premier of Victoria, Jacinda Allen, who can't bring herself to actually tell these school kids and their parents and teachers that the classroom is the best place for these kids to stay tomorrow. The big protest will be in Melbourne. And what's that doing? It's taking the division between Palestinian Australians and Jewish Australians straight into the classroom. Tell me that's a great idea.
Exactly. I mean, as I said last night, all Jewish parents are trying to shield their children from this anti-Semitism. The last thing we need is it being brought into the classroom. It's horrific and it's scary. And by the way, I echo your praise of New South Wales Premier Chris Minns. He's been incredible on this whole issue. Now to another topic today. Qantas has been crowned the least reliable domestic airline in Australia, cancelling the most flights across all major airlines last month. They were also the most likely to neither arrive nor depart on time. They ranked lower than Virgin, the regional airline Rex and their own budget airline Jetstar. Steve, this won't come as a surprise to those of us who can still afford to get interstate airfares because they've become so expensive now.
Yeah, the fares haven't come down as the airlines promised, all of them, and they need to do that quickly. In defence of Qantas, I would make one point, and I, for a couple of years, flew at least twice a week in and out of Sydney Airport. Often it's the airport itself that's causing these delays. Sydney needs desperately to have Badgerys Creek open and try and relieve congestion. You know what it's like, Sharri. You sit on a plane flying from Sydney to Melbourne. It takes you 40 minutes to taxi out to the end of the runway. And when there's a strong wind or some lightning or a bit of rain, they shut down half the runways at Sydney Airport. Melbourne is not much better. All the airlines, given what they're charging, and one of my daughters flew to Sydney and Melbourne back last weekend, and dear old dad paid for it. It's expensive. It was $430 for a return ticket in the middle of the night on Qantas from Sydney back to Melbourne and back again. So they've got to bring those fares down. As for being on time, I think Badgerys will help that, but the airlines certainly at the moment are not having a great run, are they?
No, absolutely not. Steve Price, thank you so much, as always, for your insights. Now, coming up, Dave Sharma will join me to discuss this deal that Israel has struck with Hamas, which could see hostages released as early as tomorrow. Stay tuned. Well, let's return to the breaking news today that the Israeli cabinet has agreed to a hostage deal with Hamas. 50 Israeli hostages will be released during a 4-day ceasefire in exchange for 150 Palestinian women and youth prisoners. Joining me now to discuss is Australia's former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. Welcome to the program again, Dave. What is your reaction to this deal that we've been speaking about on the show tonight, that's obviously good for families, but the IDF has expressed concern that it would give Hamas time to regroup?
Well, look, it's very welcome news for the families. I mean, we're talking here about 30 children, 12 mothers, a number of women, some children as young as 10 months old who've been seized here. And bear in mind, they were kidnapped and taken hostage, a clear war crime, and they've now been held for 46 days. So it's a tremendous relief for them and their families. Israel has obviously agreed to release women and some teenagers from Israeli jails, Palestinians, in exchange for that, and there will be a cessation of hostilities for the period it takes to transfer those over. Now, my understanding is all the Israeli security agencies, including the Israeli Defence Forces, whilst they recognise that this is going to suspend their operations for a number of days, thinks this is an important goal and they support it as well. So what I think we're likely to see is a cessation of hostilities, but I don't think this conflict is anywhere near over yet.
Look, many people are asking whether it's fair that it's 150 criminals in return for 50 innocent women and children, 1 to 3. Why is this?
Look, it's not fair. I mean, let's just start at the beginning. It was not fair or just or right or in accordance with any sort of international law for Hamas to go over the border into Israel to murder over 1,400 Israeli civilians in some of the most bloody and barbarous ways imaginable, and then take 240 people hostage. I mean, each of those is in itself a war crime. But that said, Israel is dealing with the reality that it's got people who are held captive and it wants to get home. And when you're faced with those sorts of dilemmas, you have to do what you've got to do as a state. And I'd point out in the past, Israel has done prisoner releases with Hamas. In 2011, they exchanged over 1,000 prisoners for a single Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit. And amongst those released, incidentally, was Yahya Sinwar, who's the military commander of Hamas and was one of the orchestrators of this October 7th terrorist attacks. These are the sorts of dilemmas that Israel is facing dealing with a terrorist group like Hamas.
I mean, the fact that this emergency cabinet meeting, the Israeli cabinet went for 7 hours last night, finished very late into the night. But the fact that it went for 7 hours, they didn't just reach this deal quickly, they didn't agree to it quickly. That indicates there were a lot of issues like the one you just raised that they had to work through, and giving Hamas a 4-day pause, given Hamas was pleading for this deal, it clearly shows what a desperate position the terror group is in and how Israel has been so successful so far in its operation.
Well, look, I would say this. The only reason the hostages are being released is because of the military pressure that has been put on Hamas by the Israeli Defence Forces operating within Gaza and the global diplomatic pressure, the shared global outrage at the continued holding of hostages. But for those two things and but for the military pressure the IDF has applied, Hamas would have no interest in releasing these hostages. So it does show you that, sometimes you have to do war and diplomacy at the same time, and that's what Israel is having to do in this instance.
Yeah. Now, I also want to ask you about this breaking news this afternoon, the report by the ABC that the Albanese government has granted temporary visas to 860 Palestinians between October 7 and November 20th, so after the terror attacks. This at a time when we're already having serious problems with social cohesion on our streets. We're seeing an explosion in anti-Semitism. How important is it that the government gets the security checks right and does them properly?
Well, it's vitally important, and frankly, I'm concerned at the way this has been announced. I haven't seen a statement from the Immigration Minister. I haven't seen a statement from the Home Affairs Minister. This has come from the Department of Home Affairs in response to a media inquiry. It's not clear what sort of visas these people have been granted. Are they temporary visitor visas, the subclass 600? Are they temporary protection visas? Are they a form of humanitarian visa? And that begs the next question is what sort of security checks are these people going through? Because Hamas, like any terrorist group, is disappearing into the civilian population. They'll be putting on civilian clothes, they'll be putting down their weapons, and those of them who are choosing to flee will be getting out. And just as we were very careful when we took a large caseload, rightly so, of refugees from Syria when Islamic State was running rampant there in doing security checks on those people, so we must absolutely be careful in all the security checks we do here to make sure that we're not unwittingly importing people who are Hamas fighters or loyal to Hamas, and we don't want people who will bring grievances against the Jewish community here to Australia and further stoke anti-Semitism.
And there is that propaganda that's run in many of the Palestinian territories against Israel. People are bred to hate Israel.
Look, it's unfortunately true that in the education systems, but also the government communications of a lot of the Palestinian territories, they're taught that Israel has no right to exist, that the Jewish people have no right to be there, that the Jewish people, they're taught versions of the protocols of the elders of Zion, if you remember that famous anti-Semitic text of over 100 years ago. And so, look, I mean, if these are people genuinely fleeing conflict who don't have any ties to Hamas, they don't have any antipathies towards Australia or Australian citizens, of course we should be giving them refuge and safe harbour. But I think the government needs to be upfront here with us about exactly the sort of criteria they're putting on this, exactly the sort of visa they're issuing, and is the intent for these people, once they're here in Australia, to be granted permanent protection status? I mean, this is what the government should be telling us, but at the moment, none of their ministers are visible on this issue.
All right, Dave Sharma, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for your time. Now today, Bruce Lohman's defamation case against Channel 10 kicked off. It's been dubbed a de facto rape trial, with Brittany Higgins to give evidence during the case where Channel 10 will try to prove that the allegations are substantially true. They're already hiring a lip reader to go over their CCTV footage of Higgins and Lohman in the pub that night. A criminal retrial in the ACT Supreme Court last year was abandoned amid concerns about Higgins' mental health, and the charge against Lohman was dropped. But Higgins has previously confirmed she is willing to appear as a witness to, in her words, defend the truth in any legal action brought on by Bruce Lohman. Now, Lohman is suing both Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson over their original interview with Higgins from 2021. He claims he was easily identifiable, even though he wasn't named in the story. Now, the first witness in the trial today was former political staffer Kylie Abbott, and she said she recognised that the story, both in print and then on television, was about Bruce Lohman. Lohman's barrister Matthew Richardson claimed Higgins was an unreliable witness whose evidence has been riddled with inconsistencies and improbabilities. He claimed today that among the contradictions that impacted her credibility included, and this is he's saying this, Bruce Lohman's barrister is saying this, unstable evidence in regards to the purchase of alcohol on the night in question, of the words spoken by Ms. Brown and Ms. Reynolds in the days and weeks after the alleged assault in a series of critical meetings, the reasons Brittany Higgins has given for not proceeding with a police complaint, and the manner in which material on her phone came to be deleted. Now, we've revealed at Sky News that the story was highly political from the very start, with Brittany Higgins telling the Project that she was the least interesting part of the entire saga, which was all about the Liberal Party.
Yeah, I'm not naive to the fact I'll forever be tied to this story, and it's not about me broadly. It's pretty much always going to be about the party, and it'll be about Linda, and it'll be about, and that's fine, but it's just sort of hard to reconcile personally that you're the least interesting part of your story.
Higgins also told the Project team in tapes that we obtained that her story could be timed to fit in with Katie Gallagher's ability to ask the government questions about it in the Senate.
The reason we've chosen the timeline we have is because there's a sitting week when we want the story to come out,
That's
break,
what we wanted to know. Why
March? And then Senate estimates is in March. And that's when I'm going to talk to, I've got a friend in Labor, Katie Gallagher, on the Labor side, who will prod and continue it going. So sitting week, story comes out, they have to answer questions in question time, it's a mess for them. March, Senate estimates, hopefully we can try and get the footage, that sort of stuff for Brit's clarity, and then he's going to call an election in whenever he calls it. But
soon.
That's why Brit's picked that timeline.
Now, still to come, criminal detainees, including child sex abusers, are said to be walking around without trackers. Bridget McKenzie and Andrew Charlton will join me next. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. Israel has approved a 4-day ceasefire in exchange for the release of 50 Hamas-held hostages. Bruce Lohman settled his defamation case with the ABC as his trial against Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson begins. The Prime Minister and opposition leader appeared together today at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum in a show of support against anti-Semitism. The government pledges nearly $600 million to strengthen cyber defences around Australian infrastructure and businesses. And human remains have been found in Victoria's Port Phillip Bay after a fatal plane crash on Sunday. Today, Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton stood united against anti-Semitism outside the Melbourne Holocaust Museum.
And wherever the forces of anti-Semitism are on the march, there is a need for moral courage and moral clarity. Right now, there is a need for unequivocal and unqualified condemnations of the anti-Semitism we are witnessing.
Wherever racism has raised its head, if you look for the leaders of those campaigning and speaking out against it, it is the Jewish community.
All right, joining me now, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Labor MP for Parramatta, Andrew Charlton. Great to see you both.
Good to be with you.
Andrew, I mean, look, I have to be honest, as the Jewish community, we've been crying out for leadership from the Prime Minister on anti-Semitism. He finally got there today.
Well, it's very important that we be extremely clear about anti-Semitism. There have been disgusting and disgraceful acts of anti-Semitism that have occurred in Australia over the last few weeks, and they are appalling, and there is no place for that in Australia. One thing that I do think we should be calling out, though, is the strong leadership from many elements of both the Jewish and Muslim communities. For every act of anti-Semitism, for every violent act, which are reprehensible, that we've seen at protests, we have seen a lot of courageous leadership from both the Jewish community and the Muslim community leaders who've been calling out bad behaviour, who've been promoting peace and promoting community harmony. And I think that is something that also needs to be acknowledged in this discussion.
Bridget McKenzie, these were strong and moving words today, a show of support at the relaunch of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. How important is it during this time that we just actually remember what happened during the Holocaust and how, you know, it started with the sort of sentiments we're starting to see in our society, and that's what's so terrifying.
Absolutely, Sharri, and I think it was, you know, a great event this morning where leaders from across the political divide spoke out against anti-Semitism. And when the world, after the Second World War, said never again, we're never going to allow the treatment of the Jewish people to happen like this again. And yet in our own country, we have seen, as Andrew says, despicable acts. I don't see the equivalency, though. I think anti-Semitism and this, that it's only in this unique circumstance. The Jewish people have been subjected to horrific acts throughout history, and we need to be conscious of that. I'm buoyed by the Prime Minister's newfound commitment today, but again, it's taken him a long way to get there, and as usual with this government, he's always too little, too late across a whole raft of portfolios, but on one as important as this one, they keep getting caught flat-footed, and I think it's really disappointing for our Jewish community. But congratulations on today for finding absolutely the right sentiments and words, and let's hope they back it up with actual action on the ground.
Well, breaking news this afternoon from the ABC that 860 temporary visas have been granted to Palestinians in Gaza. Now, these are not Australian citizens, Andrew. There are a lot of concerns, and Dan Tehan, the Shadow Immigration Minister, came out this afternoon to say we need to know what process has happened here, what security checks are being done. We haven't heard from the Immigration Minister or the Home Affairs Minister. Don't they need to come out and tell Australians how these 860 were selected, and to reassure us that anti-Semitism and even Hamas affiliations aren't being imported, into Australia?
Well, it is entirely routine in situations like these, and particularly conflict situations, for the Australian government to provide support for Australian citizens returning to Australia, and also for relatives of Australian citizens to return to Australia. I think most Australians would accept that that is a good thing to do. It was done by this government and it was done by the previous government. Now, in every single one of those circumstances, the Australian government applies identity and security checks. There are no exceptions to that, and in the case of these Palestinians coming from Gaza, there have been no exceptions to that.
Bridget, we haven't heard from the Immigration Minister or the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neil, like I said, we don't have really any detail about what security assessments have been done. Are you left with any confidence that, that every single one of those 860 people have been thoroughly checked to make sure there are no terror affiliations? And of course, like I said at the start of the show, many and hopefully all will just be innocent people fleeing a war zone, but the security checks need to be done.
Absolutely, Sharri. We are in the middle of a heightened war conflict in the Middle East. We need to be assured that these 860 people, individuals, aren't bringing that conflict to our shores. I want to know that our Jewish community here is reassured. And the fact that the ministers responsible for the decision and the ministers responsible for keeping Australians safe here on our shores seem to be hiding whenever the tough questions need to be asked beggars belief that the government could be caught flat-footed again and leaving a sense of uncertainty and concern at this particular time, I think speaks volumes about their competency in dealing with the challenges and the inevitable curveballs that are thrown at you when you are privileged to hold the government benches. And once again, those ministers responsible have gone hiding. Australians deserve answers. They want to be reassured, and that is the role of ministers and leaders in the Albanese government. So I would encourage and implore Minister O'Neill and Minister Giles to get in front of a camera, make it clear, reassure the Australian public that they haven't once again made an erroneous mistake through their own fallibilities that will leave Australians vulnerable in the future.
All right. Look, just on a similar immigration topic, Andrew, there are reports that there are about 4 child sex offenders who are apparently roaming the streets in WA without trackers on their ankles. The Home Affairs Minister kind of dodged questions earlier today. What's going on?
Well, let me begin by saying that if it was up to the Home Affairs Minister, none of these people would be walking the streets of Australia at all. They would all be in detention. However, the High Court made a decision that the legislative framework operated by the previous government was unconstitutional, and that has caused the Australian government now to have to respond to that decision. And we have responded to that in a way that puts community safety first. We have provided extremely strict visa requirements. We've put curfews, we've put very significant penalties for breaches of those visa requirements, and we've put ankle bracelets on those people. So we're responding to the situation very quickly, and the government is putting community safety first.
Yeah, so it's not clear what's happened in WA here, Bridget, if why these aren't being enforced, why not everyone has an ankle bracelet on them.
Yeah, and this is one of the concerns, and I congratulate Andrew on the brave face he's putting on this disastrous incident. The Labor Party had to be dragged kicking and screaming to actually put legislation through last week to ensure Australian safety. Now their job is to make sure it's implemented correctly. I mean, being in government is hard. It requires a high level of competency, and at every hurdle, this government fails on its basic core duty, which is to keep Australians safe. Now, I hope, if the reports are true, that someone is on the ground in WA locating these individuals and making sure that they are tracked appropriately before they do commit a heinous crime here on our soil in those communities. And it is beholden on the government to implement its own legislation and keep Australians safe.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Bridget McKenzie and Andrew Charlton, thank you both so much for your time. And after the break, the journalist who exposed the radical preachers in the heart of our cities, Alexei Dimitriadi, joins me next. Welcome back. Well, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil came out to condemn the violent behaviour at a pro-Palestinian protest in Sydney last night that saw police arrest 23 people. And this is after being accused of being distracted on the issue of crumbling social cohesion. The New South Wales Police Commissioner, Karen Webb, revealed that some of those arrested were professional protesters. And she suggested they weren't even that committed to the cause that they were protesting for. Have a look.
Police were very patient in dealing with that group, and 23 people are now before the court. In addition to that, I would say broadly that most of them were, a great large number of them were professional protesters who currently are protesting about the Gaza conflict, but next week they'll probably protest about something else.
The Australian's New South Wales political reporter, Alexi Dimitriadi, joins me now. Alexi, great to have you on the show. Look, this is a serious issue of anti-Semitism and a lack of social cohesion on our streets. Do you think the government's doing enough to crack down on this sort of behaviour?
Thanks for having me on, Sharri. And I think Premier Chris Minns, alongside Police Minister Yasmin Catley and Chief Commissioner Karen Webb, in that clip you saw today, that was this morning in Parliament after the scenes last night that we saw in Port Botany. And they really, especially the Premier, of course the Police Minister too, it was a very strong stance from Chris Minns against this unauthorised protest. It didn't have a Form 1, it wasn't approved by police, and it did spill into alleged criminality. So I think the stance today where Mr Minns said he absolutely backed the police, not just in the arrest made last night, but also their actions across the last 6 weeks or so. He absolutely backed them, thought their actions were absolutely appropriate. And he said very clearly, and this is almost verbatim for what he said, lawful protest is allowed in SW, but when it creeps into or extends into criminality, which it did last night, you will be arrested. NSW police will arrest you, and he will support them in doing that. So I think, particularly after the scenes on October 9 at the Opera House, Mr Minns particularly, but also the government at large, have been very strong in trying to clamp down on scenes like this.
No, he's been incredible, and I mean, we just saw the footage on the screen of how aggressive and violent those protests got last night, and Chris Minns has even strengthened laws against religious-based threats of violence after the rise in anti-Semitism we're seeing. Now, Alexi, I was so impressed with your reporting when you uncovered multiple instances of really serious radicalisation by some preachers in Sydney and in Melbourne. These are preachers calling for jihadi in the wake of the terror attacks against Jews in Israel. Tell us about what you found and whether you were surprised by the extent of the extremism that's still, in the heart of our major cities.
Thanks, Sharri, for the kind words, first of all. Myself and my colleagues at The Australian, we came across these videos of these sermons at the Al Medina Dawah Centre in Bankstown, southwest Sydney. And I think a lot of people now have seen the videos or at least read our coverage of what those videos contained. And as you said, one of them, Brother Ishmael, the first sermon, called for jihad. The next couple of sermons that were all publicly available, which is almost even more concerning, said things akin to, if all the people in the Middle East spat on Israel, the Jews would drown. And it's comments and essentially hate speech like that, to have that in the heart of Sydney, and which has been going on across the last, they've posted videos across the last 6 weeks, but it's certainly concerning, yes. Yeah. All right, it's just been amazing reporting, so keep at it. Thank you so much, Alexi, for joining me tonight. And thank you, everyone, for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock, and here's Peter Credlin.